Frogs with extra body parts started popping up all over North America in the 90s, legs growing out of faces and eyes in weird places. But why? Two-headed brown trout was found in a creek in southern Idaho, and it wasn't the only deformed fish in the area. Scientists found more trout with facial deformities, twisted fins, and defective eggs, and it all pointed to one thing: selenium pollution. Selenium is a metal that shows up naturally in the environment, but when it builds up from things like mining or coal burning, it becomes toxic. In this case, the pollution was traced back to operations run by J.R. Simplot, a massive agribusiness company that processes food and chemicals. They funded a study to look into the deformities, and while the report claimed that the selenium levels were safe, others strongly disagreed. Joseph Scorpa, a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, said the study was biased and, quote, highly questionable. He pointed out that it completely skipped over the effects on birds and reptiles and seriously downplayed the deformity rates in fish. Meanwhile, in Tennessee, politicians started pushing bills to deregulate selenium altogether. See, the coal industry has a stake in this too. What's happening in one Idaho creek is just one part of a much bigger picture. There's this fish called the Clear Lake Hitch that only lives in Clear Lake, California, and some of them have developed a mutation known as pug-headedness, which you can probably form a pretty clear image of in your head. They end up with steep, almost boxy foreheads, bulging eyes, and an underdeveloped upper jaw. Basically, the top half of the mouth doesn't grow right, so it ends up shorter than the bottom, making the whole face look warped. Scientists think this is thanks to pollution, mainly from pesticides and mercury that have built up in the lake over time. The hitch used to be everywhere in this area. They were a big part of the diet for indigenous tribes like the Pomo, and back in the day you could see massive runs every spring. These days, even in a good year, only a few thousand show up to spawn. Some years, barely any. Out in the middle of the Mojave Desert, there's this tiny deep pool called Devil's Hole. It looks like just a weird blue hole in the ground surrounded by dry rocks, but it's actually a deep water-filled crack in the earth, kind of like a natural well. And inside this tiny pool lives one of the rarest fish in the world, the Devil's Hole pupfish. These fish are tiny, smaller than your pinky finger, and they've been living here for thousands of years. The water is warm, nearly 90 degrees, and has very little oxygen. The fish need that exact setup to survive. It's a very specific environment, but they've adapted perfectly. Until recently. Right now, there are only about 75 of these fish left, and scientists are worried. Their genes are a mess. Scientists have found what's called genetic load. Basically, these fish are drowning in bad DNA, and there's no way for natural selection to clean it out. This leads to what's called an extinction vortex, where the genetic problems make it even harder to survive. Back in the 70s, conservationists built backup tanks to protect the pupfish in case the wild ones died out. But at one of these tanks, some pupfish from a nearby but different species snuck in. Their babies mixed with the DNA and grew way faster and healthier, even sprouting extra fins. The hybrids exploded in number, which showed biologist Andy Martin that introducing new genes was probably the solution here. Martin thinks the Devil's Hole pupfish could be saved if they bring in a few of these cousins from a spring just a few miles away. But some conservationists hate this idea. To them, it's not really saving this specific species of fish if you're changing their DNA. Nano silver. That sounds like an anime attack, but this is a real particle causing mutations in fish. Silver nanoparticles, tiny particles smaller than viruses, are used in over 200 consumer products because they kill bacteria on contact. Scientists are now worried these little particles might be messing with the environment and wildlife. When silver nanoparticles wash down drains, they end up in rivers, lakes. Darren Ferguson, a researcher at the University of Utah, tested these particles on zebrafish embryos in the lab and found some pretty scary mutations. Some of them became, quote, extremely distorted, almost making a number 9 or a comma instead of a linear fish, he said. The particles caused deformities in eyes, tails, and most disturbingly, their hearts. And here's something pretty scary. Zebrafish actually have organs kinda similar to ours, so this could hint at risks for people too. Scientists still don't know exactly what this means for us or the planet long term, but the Environmental Protection Agency said the same special properties that make nanoscale materials useful are also properties that may cause some nanoscale materials to pose potential risks. In California's Kestrin Reservoir, a big environmental problem popped up because of selenium pollution. Selenium is a naturally occurring element, but when it builds up too much, it becomes toxic. In Kestrin, the water got contaminated with high selenium levels, mainly from irrigation runoff. The fish there, especially embryos, started coming out with serious deformities. Some had messed up eyes or were just missing them completely. There were deformities in their fins, the brain. Scientists call this cluster of problems Kestrin syndrome. And it's not limited to fish because the birds eating them also suffered. Birds have been found with deformed beaks, legs, wings. In Oneida Lake, New York, walleye fish started appearing with tumors. This comes from exposure to chlorinated wastewater effluent. That's water discharged from treatment plants containing chlorine byproducts. So these chemicals don't break down easily and can build up in the lake. These tumors are obviously a sign that pollution in the lakes has carcinogenic effects, meaning it can cause cancer. Walleye are especially important too because they're popular for fishing, so this is worrying not only scientists but fishermen and the communities who depend on the lake. Back in the 70s, a coal-fired power plant in North Carolina started dumping wastewater full of selenium into Bellow's lake. Over time, it completely wrecked the fish population. By the early 2000s, the number of fish species in the lake dropped from 24 down to just 6. Most of the fish couldn't reproduce anymore. One study found that 19 of the original 20 species couldn't produce any surviving offspring. Only smaller fish that ate plankton, like mosquito fish, managed to stick around. They weren't affected as badly by the selenium buildup. Eventually, the plant stopped dumping the waste into the lake in 1986. Levels of selenium in the water dropped way down, and they even restocked the lake with sport fish like bass and bluegill. But even 10 years later, the fish were still having trouble reproducing. That's because selenium sinks to the lake bed and slowly leaks back into the food chain, especially if storms stir up the sediment. To make things even worse, some illegally introduced Alabama bass in 2011. They started outcompeting the native bass, especially largemouth. Now state officials are trying to get rid of them by removing catch limits, but the damage is already being done. In the Great Lakes, especially Lake Ontario and Lake Michigan, scientists have seen lake trout hatching with strange deformities. They found fish with weird faces, swollen yolk sacs, which are the little sacs attached to fish embryos that hold the nutrients they need to grow, and they have bloated areas around the heart, symptoms known as blue sac disease. It's caused by exposure to dioxins and toxic chemicals that build up in the water over years from things like industrial waste and pesticides. These toxins settle in the sediment but work their way up the food chain. Fish at the top, like lake trout, get hit hardest because they eat smaller, contaminated fish. The damage mostly shows up in the embryos, so it's affecting reproduction more than anything else. Many of the baby fish just don't survive. These deformities were first spotted decades ago and are still showing up in areas where dioxin levels are high. Even though regulations have cut down on the amount of dioxins going into the lakes, the old contamination is still there. Now, we've talked about all the bad stuff going on with fish, but what about some interesting adaptations? Well, Atlantic tomcod in the Hudson River developed a mutation that lets them survive in waters full of toxins. For decades, the river was basically a chemical dumping ground. Chemicals that usually kill or will seriously harm fish, but scientists have noticed that tomcod have developed a genetic mutation that changed how they process pollutants. Normally, these chemicals get into a fish's cells and start causing damage, but this mutation messes with the pathway the pollutants usually use. Instead, the fish store the toxins in their fat, basically locking them away where they can't cause a whole lot of harm. This trait didn't show up everywhere. It's specific to tomcod that live in polluted water. The downside, though, is that these fish are now heavily specialized to survive in dirty, polluted water. If the environment changes again, even if it's for the better, they might not adapt fast enough. And they're still concerned about predators eating them and taking in those same toxins up the food chain, including people who eat the the fish. Killifish are tiny, colorful fish found along the east coast, often in places no other fish would want to be, like New Jersey's Newark Bay or Virginia's Elizabeth River, where there's a lot of toxic waste. These areas are loaded with dioxins and heavy metals, but somehow killfish are doing pretty well, all things considered. Turns out they've evolved an insane resistance, up to 8,000 times more than normal. Researchers collected hundreds of killfish from different polluted sites and sequenced their genomes. And what they found was that each population had developed similar mutations in the same genes that basically turned off the normal response to these toxins. This kind of resistance is only possible because killfish have super high genetic diversity. For other species that don't have that kind of variation, adapting like this isn't really an option. Again though, there's still food for birds and bigger fish, so there's still a lot of worry as to how all that stored up pollution could affect the rest of the food chain.
Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have voles. Voles, those tiny furry rodents that look like they could be the star in a Disney movie, have a dark secret in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. They are the victims of their own diet. These creatures love mushrooms, and unfortunately, some mushroom species in the area are excellent at soaking up radiation like sponges. The result? Voles in radioactive hotspots show alarming trends. They're less fertile, their populations are dwindling, and their tiny eyes are developing cataracts at an unnaturally high rate. These symptoms highlight just how deeply radiation works its way through the food chain, showing no mercy even to the smallest forest residents. Next, we are talking about the mutated wolves. Wolves are not just surviving, they're actually thriving in Chernobyl's ghostly forests. Not only this, but they might actually be holding a secret that could help humanity. Studies by a Princeton University team revealed that these predators possess altered immune systems, potentially making them more resistant to cancer. Blood samples showed that their DNA has adapted in very unique ways, allowing them to tolerate the radiation-filled environment. Researchers believe these wolves could offer clues to combat cancer in humans. It's quite the twist of fate that the very landscape that should have destroyed them might have transformed them into something extraordinary. Next, we are talking about swallows. Barn swallows darting through the Chernobyl exclusion zone are more than just survivors of a nuclear disaster. They're carriers of a microscopic phenomenon that defies all logic. Nestled within their bodies are bacteria that have developed an extraordinary resistance to gamma radiation. These bacterial hitchhikers, exposed to generations of radioactive stress, have adapted in ways that turn one of nature's most destructive forces into a manageable environmental factor. Researchers have observed that these bacteria not only survive in high radiation conditions, but they actually thrive, suggesting that the disaster created an evolutionary pressure cooker that selected these near indestructible microbes. These microorganisms are effectively rewriting the rules of survival at the cellular level, raising questions about the adaptability of life in extreme conditions. Could this be a blueprint for how life might evolve in radioactive environments on other planets, or in the aftermath of nuclear catastrophes elsewhere? Next, we are talking about the lynx. The Eurasian lynx, long thought extinct in Europe, has staged a surprising return in Chernobyl's exclusion zone. With humans gone, these elusive cats have reclaimed their territory, thriving in the irradiated forests. While their radioactive exposure is unknown, scientists believe their radiation levels match other animals inside of the zone. Hundreds now roam the area, a long way from the extinction that people had thought. It is very clear that Chernobyl has shown us the unexpected consequences of a nuclear disaster, and how nature has bounced back in ways that no one even thought was possible. These predators have turned Chernobyl into their sanctuary, a radioactive kingdom where humanity no longer rules. In our number 6 spot today, we have the radioactive boars. The wild boars of Chernobyl are spreading. It sounds like a terrifying zombie movie, and honestly, it kind of is. These radioactive animals roam beyond the exclusion zone, mingling with non-radioactive boars, and then sometimes ending up as food for unsuspecting humans. In 2017, a third of wild boars tested in Germany showed radiation levels too dangerous for consumption thanks to their love of radioactive mushrooms. The boar's mobility ensures that Chernobyl's legacy continues to spread far beyond its borders, turning an ordinary forest hunt into a potential brush with disaster. At our number 5 spot and halfway mark, we have the eagles. The lynx isn't the only one making a huge comeback. The mighty white-tailed eagles, endangered across much of Europe, are making quite the appearance in Chernobyl. These birds, perched atop abandoned watchtowers, add to the ghostly atmosphere of the exclusion zone. While their populations are growing, which is great, they are not immune to radiation's effects. Researchers have found tumors, beak deformities, and lower fertility rates in some of the zone's 249 bird species. Yet, the eagles still continue to flourish, reclaiming a land stripped of human interference, but still full of invisible dangers. Next, we are talking about mutated spiders. Spiders are bad enough when they're normal. Mutated spiders are the stuff of nightmares. The spiders of Chernobyl's Red Forest are spinning webs that seem straight out of a horror movie. Their webs are oddly shaped, with chaotic patterns suggesting some very mysterious genetic mutations at play, and even more disturbing, these webs are radioactive themselves, laced with particles that have settled into the environment over decades. The spiders and their prey live and die in these toxic traps, creating a macabre cycle of contamination that illustrates how deeply radiation has seeped into even the tiniest details of life in the zone. In our number 3 spot today, we are talking about bison. The hulking bison of Chernobyl's exclusion zone, weighing up to a staggering 2,200 pounds, are living symbols of nature's resilience, but also its vulnerabilities. These majestic creatures graze on vegetation laced with radioactive particles absorbed from the soil. Every mouthful of grass or bark adds to their radiation load as isotopes like cesium-137 and strontium-90 continue to circulate through the ecosystem decades after the disaster. Their sheer size and strength make them nearly invincible to predators, but radiation exposure has its own invisible consequences. Researchers have raised concerns about the long-term effects on their health and reproduction, including potential mutations, weakened immune systems, and shortened lifespans. Even more unsettling is the role these bison play in spreading the contamination. As they roam through the exclusion zone, their movements redistribute radioactive particles. Despite the risks, like many of the other animals, the bison have found a strange kind of sanctuary in this human-free wilderness. Their numbers are growing, and conservationists cautiously monitor their progress, marveling at how one of Europe's rarest animals has adapted to an environment hostile to most life forms. Next, we are talking about invertebrates. From one of the largest animals to some of the smallest, beneath the soil of Chernobyl's forests, the tiny creatures are waging a quiet battle for survival. Populations of bumblebees, butterflies, and grasshoppers have plummeted in areas with high radiation. The radioactive soil, saturated with cesium-137 and strontium-90, interferes with their ability to lay viable eggs, cutting off future generations. These losses ripple up the food chain, affecting everything from birds to small mammals. Invertebrates' decline is a reminder that radiation's most devastating impacts often begin with the smallest players in an ecosystem. And finally, to end off this list, in our number 1 spot, we are talking about fungi. For this one, we are heading right inside the heart of the reactor itself, the place where this all really started. Deep within the reactor's ruins, black fungi cling to life on the walls of the destroyed core itself. Species like Cryptococcus Staphylococcus neoformans and Cladosporium don't just survive radiation, they actually use it as an energy source. Researchers have discovered that these fungi contain melanin, a pigment that absorbs ionizing radiation and turns it into chemical energy, much like plants use sunlight in photosynthesis. This ability, dubbed radiotropism, is as unsettling as it is fascinating, raising questions about what other life forms might adapt to survive in similarly extreme conditions.
April of 2023, Australian farmers at a small hobby farm in Queensland noticed one of their hens had not 2, not 3, but 4 legs. 2 extra limbs dangled awkwardly from her rear end. Now, what's really interesting about this case is that the other chickens noticed this, and they did not like it. They bullied her. They pecked at the extra legs, pecked so hard that feathers fell out and a wound formed. The chicken had polymylia, a rare birth defect where extra limbs form, usually when an embryo starts as a twin and then reabsorbs but leaves parts behind. And looking at this chicken, you can see that these are full legs. They're not just these little stumps that barely look like legs, they're functional. A local farmer eventually rehomed the 4-legged hen to someone willing to take care of her separately, otherwise the rest of the flock would have tormented her, probably to death. In the late 90s, people started finding frogs with freakish mutations all across North America, like legs growing out of their faces or 2 extra limbs near their chest. One kid in Minnesota came across a 5-legged bullfrog in 1996, and stories kept rolling in from states like Wisconsin and even into Quebec, Canada. It wasn't a cartoonish anomaly. These deformities were very real. There were misshapen eyes as well, appendages sprouting in weird spots, and sometimes even had mixed reproductive bits. Researchers weren't sure what was going on here, but eventually they landed on this messy cocktail of causes. Parasites burrowing into tadpoles, chemicals seeping into ponds, UV light messing with embryos, and just predators biting off limbs that then regrew in wonky ways. They called it a sign something was going wrong with the environment. Over time, they narrowed it down to 4 main issues, but no single culprit explains every case. These frogs are still popping up today, just thankfully not in huge numbers, but every once in a while someone pulls a limbless tadpole or a frog with an eye in its shoulder out of a pond. In 2020, a homeowner in Florida was surprised when her daughter brought a tiny snake into the house. The cat had caught it. Small, but it still shocked her because it had 2 fully formed heads on its body, each head moving independently with its own tongue, eyes, even competing for control when they ate. Wildlife officials named him Doss and said it was a southern black racer. This kind of mutation, called bicephaly, happens when an embryo splits and then stops, basically creating an identical twin that doesn't fully separate. The snake was taken in by Florida fish and wildlife experts who said this snake could survive in human care, but that chances in nature would be slim. Snakes like this can't dodge predators as easy, they can't grab food as easy, they can't even agree with each other. One head might go left, the other wants to go right. It's just an absolute nightmare. So while a 2-headed snake sounds pretty dangerous, you'd actually have an easier time dealing with 2 heads than 1. Next up is the Dracula fish, a tiny see-through freshwater fish discovered in Myanmar in 2007. It's just 1.7 centimeters long. The males have these creepy fang-like bones protruding from their jaws. Not scales or teeth, but actual bone structures that jut out in front like vampire fangs. Scientists say billions of years ago, its ancestors lost real teeth, but this lineage reversed course and grew bone fangs again. Evolution in reverse. Pretty cool. These fangs are used by males in fights. They jab at each other in territorial squabbles. The fish is translucent, almost larva-like, and has far fewer bones than normal fish. Most of its body is cartilage, which just makes its fangs stand out even more. Scientists still don't know how or why this exact setup came about. Fangs regrowing in a species millions of years after losing them is pretty wild, and since it's only been found in one small stream, it's just kind of a freak show of nature that may never exist anywhere else. In September of 2024, a farm in Kentucky welcomed a calf that looked like some sort of bizarre Frankenstein creation. It had two fully formed heads on one body. Each had its own eyes, snout, and neck, but they shared a single body and internal organs like a heart and lungs. The little calf also had other issues: a cleft palate, twisted spine, underdeveloped rectum, and weird jointed legs. Farmers said the odds of something like this happening are around 1 in 400 million. I'm not sure how they find that number, but apparently that's the case. And unfortunately, the calf didn't make it past its first day. And honestly, as bad as this might sound, I think that's a good thing. I mean, not only would it have had a poor quality of life, but you really want to see this thing walking around. Casey Tarter, one of the farmers, is also an agricultural student at Western Kentucky University. She mentioned the two-headed calf in class, saying they decided to use it as a learning opportunity. They took detailed photos, they examined its oddly fused organs, and used the data to teach about developmental issues in mammals. In March of 2018 in Shangjing, China, a farmer found a calf with 6 legs, where there were 2 normal legs at the front and then 4 weirdly dangling limbs from its belly. The calf had trouble moving because of the extra limbs, but other than that, it was doing okay and quickly became a local attraction. People from the area started visiting the farm just to take pictures with the calf. This isn't the first time something like this happened in China. Back in 2014, another 6-legged cow was born in Shandong. This one had 2 extra legs growing out of its neck. The farmer Zhang Gongjun, who helped deliver the calf, said, "I've raised the mother for 5 years and seen her through 4 births, and I've never seen anything like this before." Once his friends shared photos of the cow online, people started showing up. Zhang said, "I get crowds of people here every day and all kinds of camera crews from TV stations." According to a 2002 study, cases like this are very rare. Only around 4 in every 100,000 cattle are born with extra limbs. In August of 2019, an angler named Debbie Geddes pulled a trout out of Lake Champlain, which had 2 mouths, one where it should be and another just below it. Her photo went viral, with people calling it the catch of a lifetime. But scientists don't actually think this was a genetic mutation. They think it could have been caused by an injury that healed oddly, creating what looks like a second mouth. One researcher from Harvard said this sort of deformity can happen when soft tissues heal in strange ways, not because of DNA changes. But that's just one theory. Nobody really knows what the deal was with this fish. Geddes released it back into the water. In October of 2021, a rare 2-headed turtle, later named Mary-Kate and Ashley, hatched in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. It was a diamondback terrapin that hatched with a rare condition that caused it to have 2 heads and 6 legs, all sharing one shell. Bird's Eye Cape Wildlife Center posted a photo of it on Facebook, along with the caption, "This is a condition called bicephaly. It's a rare anomaly that can occur from both genetic and environmental factors that influence an embryo during development." Even though animals with this condition usually don't make it very long, the staff felt pretty hopeful. The turtles continued to be, quote, bright and active, and were eating, swimming, and gaining weight each day. Mary-Kate and Ashley were discovered in a protected nesting spot. Researchers noticed that while they shared a shell, they each had their own spine and digestive system and seemed to team up to move around. In 2023, during heavy monsoon rains in India, farmers found a 5-foot albino cobra slithering through their home. Unlike some pale snakes though, this one lacked the dark pigmentation entirely, so it actually kind of glowed pale pink in the rain. Albino cobras are almost unheard of because without pigment, their skin is very sensitive to sun and their vision usually suffers. This snake was venomous, fully grown, yet somehow it managed to avoid predators and humans until it found shelter in this person's home. Wildlife rescue teams safely captured it, and the cobra was taken to a wildlife rehabilitation center, where vets said its survival was slim but improved with care. But while albino animals pop up here and there, an adult albino venomous snake is shockingly rare, apparently. In 2023, conservationists in Western Australia came across this bright blue frog with white spots, totally different from your average green tree frog. Field researchers at night heard some rustling and wandered over to see it perched near the workshop. The frog lacked the yellow pigment thanks to a genetic mutation, leaving only the blue tone behind. It's so rare that Jody Rowley, a biologist who studied tens of thousands of these frogs, said she'd never seen anything like it in her entire career. Scientists don't know if this blue frog will survive, find a mate, or have a shot at passing its color on, but regardless, it's a reminder that wild genetics can still surprise us.
Starting off this list today, we are talking about double-headed snakes. Ever been startled by nature's own glitch? Double-headed snakes are one of the most jaw-dropping examples of polycephaly, a condition where an embryo fails to fully split during development. These snakes emerge with two heads, each with its own set of instincts that can conflict with one another. Imagine one head wanting to attack while the other hesitates. This internal tug of war often leaves the creature struggling to feed or move properly, and while this phenomenon is most famously seen in snakes, it's also been spotted in turtles, lizards, and even birds. It's a wild reminder of how delicate and unpredictable nature can be. Next, we are talking about the cyclopic fish. What could go wrong with a fish's blueprint? Cyclopic fish with a single central eye instead of the usual pair are a startling example of developmental disruption. These mutations typically result from severe genetic errors or exposure to toxins during early growth stages, leaving the fish with a disorienting, almost cartoonish appearance. The lone eye is rarely enough for proper vision, making survival nearly impossible. Scientists study these rare cases to uncover the intricate signaling pathways involved in eye formation, turning what might seem like a gruesome anomaly into a key puzzle piece in understanding developmental biology. Next, we are talking about the amphibian limbs. Ever seen an amphibian that doesn't quite fit the mold? Frogs and salamanders sometimes hatch with extra, missing, or oddly deformed limbs due to genetic glitches or environmental disturbances like pollution and parasitic infections. These mutations don't just make for a bizarre appearance, they can severely impair an animal's ability to escape predators or forage for food. While these deformities might sound like something from a horror story, they also offer researchers invaluable insights into how environmental factors can disrupt the delicate process of limb development in nature. Next, we are talking about the ocular growths. What if a creature's eyes went rogue? In rare cases, amphibians are born with extra or misaligned eyes due to aberrant ocular growth. These malformed structures can throw off the creature's entire visual system, resulting in significant impairments that make it difficult to navigate or to hunt. Although such mutations are extremely uncommon, they provide scientists with a unique window into the complexities of eye development, revealing just how finely tuned and vulnerable these processes really are. Next, we are talking about the insect appendages. Ever noticed an insect that looks like it came with bonus parts? Sometimes genetic errors or environmental stressors cause insects to sprout extra wings, legs, or antennae, turning an ordinary bug into a walking, flying oddity. These extra appendages aren't superpowers. They tend to hinder the insect's ability to move, feed, and survive in the wild. Yet this bizarre twist of nature's offers entomologists a fascinating glimpse into how even minor disruptions in the genetic blueprint can lead to dramatic and unexpected changes in form and in function. Next, we are talking about turtle shells. What if nature's armor wasn't built to last? Turtles and tortoises sometimes hatch with malformed shells, gaping, asymmetrical, or oddly contoured due to developmental mutations. Their shell is their primary defense against predators, and any flaw can leave them dangerously exposed to environmental hazards. Often linked to temperature fluctuations during embryonic development, these shell deformities are a stark reminder of how even slight changes in early conditions can have life-altering effects on the animal's survival. Next, we are talking about two-tailed lizards. Ever been intrigued by a lizard with an extra tail? Lizards are known for their impressive tail regeneration skills, but sometimes this process goes awry, resulting in a bifurcated or split tail. While a two-tailed lizard might seem like something out of a fantasy novel, the extra tail usually disrupts the creature's balance and coordination, making everyday survival a bit of a tougher challenge. Interestingly, this mutation isn't always permanent. It can be the result of incomplete regeneration following an injury, offering a quirky insight into nature's remarkable yet imperfect repair mechanisms. From turtle shells, we are now talking about crab shells. What happens when a crab's armor becomes a bit of a burden? Exposure to pollutants or random genetic anomalies can cause crabs to develop grotesquely misshapen exoskeletons. These abnormal growths not only distort the crab's appearance, but also impede its movement and feeding abilities, turning it into an easy target for predators. Despite the grim reality for the affected crabs, studying these mutations helps marine biologists understand the environmental pressures that can disrupt crustacean development and highlights the vulnerability of marine ecosystems to external stressors. Next, we are talking about bird wings. Ever wondered how a bird survives with uneven wings? Some birds hatch with asymmetrical wing development, where one wing is noticeably different in size or shape from the other. This imbalance can be catastrophic, severely limiting their ability to fly, evade predators, or compete for food. Often indicative of deeper developmental issues, such wing deformities serve as a harsh reminder that nature's precise engineering isn't infallible. For the birds affected, even a small deviation in wing symmetry can mean the difference between survival and a life grounded by physical limitations. And finally, to end off this list, we are talking about blob plants. What if a plant's growth turned into a bizarre work of art? Fascination is a mutation where a plant's growing tip becomes elongated, flattened, or swollen, resulting in oddly blob-like structures that defy the usual natural symmetry. Though this mutation might produce a look that's almost otherworldly or a little bit grotesque, it provides scientists with unique insights into the genetic and environmental factors that influence plant development. Triggered by everything from genetic errors to infections or even physical damage, fascination challenges our expectations of natural beauty and reveals the unpredictable side of nature's creative process.
Superbugs are bacteria that have developed resistance to the antibiotics we rely on to treat infections. This is becoming a bit of a concern because it means that infections which used to be easy to treat with simple antibiotics could become deadly again, and these superbugs can spread quickly, especially in places like hospitals where people are already weakened by other health issues. Bacteria learn to fight off the treatments we use to kill them, so the usual treatments don't work anymore. In some cases, even the strongest antibiotics available have no effect. If things were to continue like this, we might be looking at a world where simple cuts or infections could become life-threatening again, and things that used to be manageable, like pneumonia or urinary tract infections, could be lethal. We've already seen some superbugs in action. The most famous example is probably MRSA, which resists common antibiotics and can cause everything from minor skin infections to more serious ones. There are others out there like C. difficile and multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, and without new antibiotics or treatments, the future could look a lot like it did before antibiotics were discovered. A lot of people could die from infections that we just don't think twice about because they're so easy to treat. Apparently our DNA has a lot of what's called junk, which are stretches of genetic material that don't seem to have any specific purpose. But scientists are starting to worry that some of this so-called junk DNA might suddenly turn on in ways we don't understand. If these dormant genes were to activate, they could cause unexpected mutations mutations in our cells, leading to diseases or even new forms of cancer. The problem is they don't know exactly what these dormant genes do. I don't know though, I mean, why be all doom and gloom about it? Maybe these dormant genes are more like the X gene in X-Men, and we'll start having people with laser eyes and the power to control the weather. They should look into that. If these genes were to wake up though, they could potentially start producing harmful proteins or cause other genetic problems that result in serious health issues. Some scientists again think that certain forms of cancer might be linked to junk DNA. Gene editing technology, especially CRISPR, has been a pretty huge leap in science. They can now make some incredibly precise changes to DNA, which opens up all sorts of possibilities, from curing genetic diseases to creating crops that are resistant to pests. But there's a looming threat behind it: the risk of unintended mutations. Even though CRISPR is incredibly accurate, it's not perfect. Sometimes it can cut or alter DNA in unexpected ways, creating problems that no one saw coming. Changes like this could potentially cause new diseases, or make existing ones even worse. One big concern is that these unintended mutations could be passed on to future generations, making the problem even worse. Imagine editing a gene to prevent a disease, but instead you accidentally create a new health issue that's even worse than the one you were trying to avoid in the first place. And of course, forget mistakes even, sometimes people just cause harm intentionally. Another fear is that CRISPR could be used to create bioweapons, and God knows what else. There's definitely a lot of good that can come from gene editing, but still a lot we don't know about what can happen long term. Xenobiology is the study of life that isn't quite like the life we know on Earth. It's about creating new artificial life forms, organisms that don't naturally occur in nature but are designed by humans. So with advances in synthetic biology, scientists have already created bacteria and even yeast that have been altered. As you can probably guess though, the big concern here is that these artificial life forms could mutate in unpredictable ways, creating new diseases or causing harm to the environment. One of the biggest worries is that these new life forms could escape the lab and spread into the wild, where they might compete with or disrupt natural ecosystems. Let's say we had some genetically altered lab bacteria that could eat plastic, but instead of stopping once it's eaten enough, it just mutates to start breaking down other materials that are essential to life. Or imagine we had a synthetic organism that can survive in extreme environments like the deep ocean and suddenly becomes a global threat. There's a very real potential for unpredictable consequences, and as we get better at creating life in a lab, the risks of these organisms mutating into Frankenstein-like creations also becomes more of a possibility. Bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or to put it in fancier terms, mad cow disease, is a deadly disease known as a prion disease, a disorder of the brain that affects cattle and can, in rare cases, be transmitted to humans through infected beef. This disease is caused by what's called a misfolded protein, a protein that has folded incorrectly, resulting in a toxic shape. Once it takes hold, it leads to brain degeneration. So what if a prion disease like mad cow were to mutate, making it more easily spread and deadly? The thing about prion diseases is that they're incredibly difficult to treat. There are no antibiotics or antiviral treatments that work against them, and they often take years to develop symptoms. And as cattle farming practices change or new methods of processing meat are introduced, these types of diseases could evolve and spread in ways that we're just not prepared for. And because prion diseases are so contagious and devastating once they take hold, scientists are keeping a close watch on the possibility that new mutated forms could grow and pose a serious risk to global health. Fungal infections are another area where mutations could cause huge problems. Candida auris, for example, is a pretty nasty fungus that people tend to get in hospitals when they already have weakened immune systems. What's really creepy about this one is that it's mutated to become resistant to most antifungal treatments, so it's almost impossible to get rid of. It can cause severe infections, especially in people, again, with weakened immune systems, and because it's so resistant to treatment, it's a nightmare for doctors trying to treat it. But the problems don't stop there. Fungi like Candida auris get better at surviving in hospital environments where they're more likely to come in contact with vulnerable patients. And because they're so hard to treat, they can spread quickly between patients, making outbreaks much harder to contain. The fear is that if these fungi keep mutating, they'll become even harder to fight, potentially leading to even deadlier infections that can spread across entire hospitals or communities. As our oceans continue getting warmer, scientists are seeing an increase in the amount and size of toxic algae blooms. Now, toxic algae blooms, or harmful algae blooms, happen when certain types of algae grow out of control, producing toxins that can cause all sorts of problems. These toxins can contaminate drinking water, poison marine life, and even cause neurological diseases in humans. Some of these algae produce a toxin called domoic acid, which can poison the shellfish, which in turn causes brain damage in humans who go on to eat the contaminated seafood. And the issue is only expected to get worse as the planet keeps getting warmer. The ocean becomes the perfect condition for algae to thrive. And as these algae blooms become more common and more toxic, they're posing a bigger and bigger threat to ecosystems underwater and our human health. In the same vein, pollution and radiation is causing issues with fish. We're starting to show signs of some pretty bizarre mutations. Some fish have been found with extra fins, extra eyes, or other strange mutations that you just rarely see in nature. Only now it's becoming more common. Mutations like this can be caused by chemicals and radiation leaking into the environment from industrial buildings like power plants and factories. What's worrying scientists is that these mutations could potentially spread to other species and mess up entire ecosystems. If these mutated fish were to pass on their altered genes to their offspring, it could result in entire populations of animals with extra eyes or tentacles and tumors. It'd just be a mess. And as nasty as that would be, it could have ripple effects in the food chain, affecting everything from the fish that humans eat to the animals that depend on these fish for food. We're already seeing signs of these mutations in fish populations near areas with heavy amounts of pollution, and there's real concern that as these changes spread, we might see bigger shifts in marine life that could be difficult, if not impossible, to undo. Environmental radiation is another huge concern when it comes to mutations. This can come from nuclear accidents like Chernobyl or Fukushima, radioactive waste, or even just natural sources of radiation in the environment. When plants, animals, or even humans are exposed to this radiation, it can cause pretty gnarly genetic mutations, and these mutations can get passed down through generations. There are cases of what's called the Chernobyl heart, for example, a heart condition in infants whose mothers were exposed to radiation in Chernobyl, and these mutations can spread throughout ecosystems, affecting populations of animals and plants. Over time, the genetic changes could accumulate, leading to new diseases and deformities. Again, the Chernobyl disaster created this huge area of radioactive contamination, and scientists have found a whole bunch of mutations in animals and plants living there. Some of these mutations are mostly harmless, but others could lead to long-term health problems or even extinction for certain species. Radiation mutations aren't always spotted immediately either. It can take a while for them to manifest, but they can be incredibly dangerous in the long term. And another concerning mutation that's getting more attention is the rise of chemical-induced mutations in plants, especially crops. Pesticides and herbicides, which have been used to protect plants from pests and weeds, are causing some pretty weird and unexpected genetic changes in the plants themselves. Over time, these chemicals can create mutations that make the plants more resistant to the chemicals, leading to what are called superweeds that are harder to control. And once again, some of these mutations might be passed on to future generations of plants, creating entire populations that are resistant to herbicides and pesticides. What if we were to run out of ways to protect crops? We'd have no vegetables, which of course means no popcorn at movie theaters, meaning I'd probably never bother going to the movies again, and that is a terrifying note to end on. After the Chernobyl disaster, one of the first obvious signs of mutation was in the local bird populations. Researchers started noticing barn swallows with bright white patches, a condition called partial albinism, which is rare under normal circumstances. And along with the odd coloring though, some birds had twisted beaks, deformed toes, and strangely shaped tail feathers. These weren't just small defects either. Some of the beak deformities made it almost impossible for the birds to feed properly. According to studies published in journals like Biological Conservation, these mutations were especially common within the highly contaminated areas closest to the reactor. The birds' survival rates were much lower than normal too. A lot of the albino swallows didn't make it through their first year. Scientists figure the radiation damaged their DNA, leading to these visible abnormalities. Interestingly, the frequency of these mutations actually gives researchers clues about how dangerous certain areas still are today. High numbers of mutated swallows usually means higher residual radiation levels. Even now, generations later, you could still find birds around Chernobyl with unusual markings or growth defects. Inside Chernobyl, scientists discovered something totally unexpected. Some species of fungi show a phenomenon called radiotropism, where instead of growing toward light like normal plants, these fungi actually grow toward radioactive material. According to research shared by the National Institutes of Health, these fungi use melanin, the same pigment that gives human skin its color, to absorb radiation and turn it into energy. Almost like photosynthesis, but instead of using sunlight, they're using deadly gamma rays. So not only can these fungi handle huge doses of radiation that would kill most living things, they actually prefer it. Samples were even brought up to the International Space Station to see how they would react to cosmic radiation, and again, they were just fine. One of the eeriest sights in Chernobyl is the Red Forest, a place where pine trees absorbed so much radiation that they turned rusty red before dying. But some trees didn't just die, they mutated. According to the BBC, researchers noticed that a lot of pine trees developed strange needles. Instead of fanning out like normal, their needles were clumped together in these thick, tangled bunches. In some cases, the trees looked almost like natural bonsai, stunted, twisted, sometimes missing their tops completely. Normally, pines grow in a clean, upward pointing shape, but radiation damage scrambled their growth patterns. Mutations affected how cells divided and how these trees structured their branches and leaves. Some trees stayed abnormally small even decades later, others grew in these chaotic, knotted shapes. Scientists say the Red Forest today is one of the most radioactive outdoor places on Earth, so it makes sense that the trees would be kinda messed up. While a lot of animals around Chernobyl died off after the meltdown, some species, like the bank vole, a small rodent, adapted pretty well. According to a study in Nature Communications, these rodents show clear signs of genetic damage. Their DNA has more breaks and mutations compared to voles living outside the zone, but instead of dying out, a lot of them have somehow developed to better repair their DNA. It's not that the radiation didn't mess them up, it absolutely did. Researchers just found evidence of abnormalities. What's crazy though is that these voles are still surviving in one of the most contaminated parts of the world. Some scientists think natural selection favored ones that could fix their damaged DNA better, allowing them to pass those traits on. Rotifers, microscopic animals that live in fresh water, have been studied in Chernobyl's contaminated ponds. According to Frontiers in Microbiology, researchers found that rotifers from the exclusion zone can survive much higher doses of radiation than ones outside it. Instead of just dying from DNA damage like you'd expect, these rotifers seem to have upgraded at a cellular level. They developed better systems of repairing their DNA, and possibly even in ways to protect it from radiation damage in the first place. Rotifers are already known for surviving crazy conditions like being frozen solid or dried out for years, but Chernobyl pushed them even further. These little guys adapted in a way that scientists are still trying to fully understand. And now, some researchers are looking into whether the rotifers' abilities could help humans or other animals deal with radiation better one day. Right after the Chernobyl explosion, researchers started noticing that insects were showing some changes. Beetles and grasshoppers with missing parts became pretty common. The worst mutations showed up in areas closest to the reactor, where radiation levels were just off the charts, of course. Insects would hatch with warped or missing body parts that made it almost impossible for them to survive. Wings would come out crumpled, antennae, which insects need to sense their environment, would be stubs or just completely gone. Some beetles had legs growing in the wrong places or extra limbs. Scientists were able to connect the number and severity of deformities directly to how much radiation the insects were exposed to. The first few years after the disaster saw the worst of it, obviously. Over time, the number of severe mutations dropped. mostly because the most damaged insects didn't survive to reproduce. After the Chernobyl disaster, a group of wild Przewalski's horses, an endangered species, was introduced into the exclusion zone in the late 90s. These horses actually started doing pretty well in the abandoned human-free landscape, but not everything was normal. Researchers noticed that some of the horses were being born with these strange physical defects, like shortened, scruffy manes and unusually stubby tails. The deformities weren't as extreme as some other animals, but there was still a lot of concern about whether radiation exposure had messed with the horse's development. Normally, Przewalski's horses have thick, upright manes and long tails, which help protect them from insects and the elements, but these Chernobyl ones looked rougher. There's still debate about whether the radiation is the direct cause or if it's more about poor nutrition in the contaminated environment, but either way, the odd physical changes were real. Not everything in Chernobyl shrank or mutated into weird broken shapes. Some plants actually grew bigger. Certain species of moss, mushrooms, and ferns in the exclusion zone started showing signs of gigantism after the disaster. According to the Journal of Environmental Radioactivity, radiation seems to have messed with the genes that control how these plants grow. Instead of growing normally, some plants ended up with these oversized leaves or unusually thick stems. It's believed that the radiation disrupted the normal signals that tell plants when to stop growing, leading to these bizarre, almost monster-like versions. In some parts of the Red Forest, ferns grew much larger than expected, and certain mushrooms popped up freakishly big. Scientists think this is because mutations either removed natural growth limits or somehow activated dormant genetic traits. Of course, just because a plant is bigger though doesn't mean it's healthier. A lot of these oversized plants had heavy radioactive contamination. Research has shown that birds living in the most radioactive areas around Chernobyl had brains that were about 15% smaller than birds from clean areas. Researchers think that radiation exposure during development damaged cells in their brain, either killing them off or stopping them from forming properly. They found that younger birds had it worse than adults, meaning that radiation was having a serious effect during the earliest stages of life. And those birds with smaller brains, unsurprisingly, had lower survival rates. What you're looking at here is the only known photograph of a creature known as the Blackbird of Chernobyl. In early April of 1986, people living around the Chernobyl nuclear power plant started reporting something strange. Witnesses described seeing this huge, dark creature, like a man, but without a head. It had massive wings and glowing red eyes. Locals started calling it the Blackbird of Chernobyl. Sightings of this thing kept piling up, right up until the morning of April 26th, when Reactor 4 exploded. That disaster unleashed a radioactive cloud that spread across parts of the Soviet Union, Europe, and North America. The area around Chernobyl was just devastated. Over 300,000 people had to evacuate. Still considered the worst nuclear accident in human history. In the chaos after the explosion, though, Soviet helicopters dumped sand, lead, and other materials onto the burning reactor, trying to smother the fire. Firefighters, not realizing they were dealing with a radioactive inferno, rushed in, often without proper protection. A lot of them would die soon after the radiation poisoning, including Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik, who passed away just weeks later. But some of those firefighters who survived long enough to talk, well, they reported seeing this massive, dark, winged creature flying through the radioactive smoke above Reactor 4. After the meltdown, sightings of the Blackbird stopped completely. Some people believe that the Blackbird of Chernobyl was the same kind of entity as the Mothman, the creature seen in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, before the Silver Bridge collapsed in 1967. Both creatures had similar appearances, giant wings, red eyes, and in both cases, there were also reports of nightmares and strange, threatening phone calls before disaster struck. Another theory is that people might have actually been seeing a black stork, but the black stork only has a 6-foot wingspan, not 20. And that bird doesn't explain the terrifying dreams and phone calls that witnesses talked about. Whatever the Blackbird really was, though, it hasn't been seen again since Chernobyl. Whether it's a warning, a bad omen, or just mass hysteria, no one really knows. But if it ever shows up again, history says something very bad might not be far behind. What you're looking at here is a frog affected by the radiation of Chernobyl. In 2016, two Spanish researchers, Pablo Barraco and German Oriozola, were studying how life was bouncing back in Pripyat, and they noticed something strange: black frogs. Now, obviously, dark-colored frogs on their own aren't unusual, but the type of frog they were looking at, Hyla orientalis, a tree frog native to the area, is usually bright green. So what happened? Well, it turns out it might be evolution caused by the radiation. The darker skin isn't random. These frogs have developed higher levels of melanin, the same pigment that protects human skin from UV damage. In this case, it helps block radiation from damaging the frog's cells. And it seems this shift happened fast. Within a few decades, a bright green species started turning dark to survive in a nuclear zone. It's one of the clearest examples of nature adapting. Instead of dying out, these frogs have adjusted their biology to deal with one of the harshest environments on the planet. This is Jeremy Wade, River Monsters guy, pulling a massive catfish out of one of the cooling ponds near the Chernobyl power plant. These ponds are still radioactive. Wade mentioned the fish he caught had radiation levels about 16 times higher than normal. But what really grabs attention is the size of these things. They're huge. People have wondered if radiation is causing these fish to mutate and grow into monsters, but it may not be the radiation that's making them giants. It's more about the environment. These ponds are closed off, meaning the catfish are at the top of the food chain. No predators, tons of food, and people even feed them sometimes, so over time they just get bigger and bigger. They're living longer as well, which adds to their size. Now, that doesn't mean they're not being affected by the radiation. They're definitely soaking it in, and scientists are still studying whether there are long-term mutations or effects we can't see from the outside. Either way though, these catfish are a real reminder of how life can keep going in places where it really shouldn't. Wolves in Chernobyl aren't just surviving, they might actually be evolving. In 2014, Dr. Cara Love and her team from Princeton headed to the exclusion zone and put GPS collars on several wolves to track them. These collars didn't just show where the wolves were going, they also measured radiation exposure in real time. The wolves were getting hit with radiation levels up to 6 times the legal safety limit for humans every single day. That should be deadly, but instead of dying off, the wolves seem to be adapting. BLOOD samples showed changes in their immune systems, almost like what you'd see in a person going through radiation therapy. Even more interesting, parts of their DNA looked like they were evolving to resist cancer. In a place where cancer risk should be through the roof, these wolves are developing ways to fight it. Now, because of the situation in Ukraine and obvious safety concerns, the research is slowed down, but if what they've actually found holds up, these wolves might be the key to understanding how to survive in high radiation environments. Because we all want to do that, right? Maybe even how to treat cancer in humans one day. Now that we definitely want. Wild boars in the Chernobyl exclusion zone are basically radiation sponges. Out of the animals still hanging around, these guys are carrying some of the highest levels of radioactive material in their bodies, and it all comes down to what they eat. Boars dig through the soil looking for roots, insects, and mushrooms, especially deer truffles. And those truffles are loaded with radiation because the soil around Chernobyl is still contaminated. So the boars eat and the radiation builds up inside them. Over time, it's had some nasty effects. People have reported sightings of boars with strange growths, tumors, physical deformities. It's not like they're growing extra legs or anything out of a comic book, but their bodies clearly aren't doing great. Radiation messes with their cells and weakens their immune systems, making them more likely to get sick or develop weird internal issues. But even still, they are surviving. Maybe not as well as the dogs or wolves, but they've managed to reproduce and live in this environment. Some are even leaving the exclusion zone and mixing with boar populations in other parts of Europe, which is kind of concerning. So this may not be a living thing, but considering it's a glob of radioactive goo, I mean, I don't know, maybe it is. It's known as the elephant's foot, one of the most famous concoctions to come out of the Chernobyl disaster. After Reactor 4 blew up, a bunch of nuclear fuel, metal and concrete fused together under the plant and cooled into this massive lump of radioactive material, and it kinda looked like a deformed elephant's foot. Thus it was dubbed the elephant's foot. When this thing was first formed, it was putting out so much radiation that standing near it for just a few minutes could kill you. Not exaggerating. People who had to go near it in the early days of cleanup would get a lethal dose of radiation in minutes. One guy who filmed it back in the 80s was reportedly dead within a year. Even now, decades later, it's still dangerous. The radiation has cooled down a bit, but not enough to really make it safe. Scientists have kept an eye on it over the years because they were worried it might keep leaking radiation or start heating up again. It's also affected the air, water, and soil around it. They call the elephant's foot a kind of man-made lava, except instead of burning you, it poisons you. And yeah, it's still sitting there, deep under reactor 4, slowly decaying, but still very dangerous. Now, right next to the Chernobyl plant is a place called the Red Forest, and it got that name for a pretty grim reason. When reactor 4 exploded, it sent a radioactive cloud directly over this patch of forest, and within hours, the pine trees turned a weird rust red color. Basically, they died almost instantly from radiation exposure. That entire section of forest just collapsed. But over the years, new trees started growing again. Not quite like before though. Scientists have found trees with bizarre growth patterns. Some have twisted trunks, stunted branches, or grow at strange angles. A few have odd discolorations or split limbs that don't match normal growth cycles. Even now, decades later, radiation levels in the Red Forest are some of the highest in the whole exclusion zone. The forest acts like a sponge, so any rain that soaks into the soil can stir up radioactive particles again. Now, beside the massive catfish in the cooling ponds near Chernobyl, smaller fish in the rivers and lakes around Pripyat have shown some pretty unsettling traits. Researchers have talked about fish with physical deformities like missing eyes, bulging growths coming out of them, or just oddly shaped in general. The radiation that poured into the nearby waterways didn't just disappear, it seeped into the water, settling in the silt and got into the food chain. Small aquatic creatures absorbed it, and the fish that ate them absorbed even more. That kind of exposure messes with how cells divide and grow, and that's how you end up with fish that look like Blinky from The Simpsons. And then there are all the issues you can't see with the naked eye. Some fish are born sterile, others just don't live as long as they should, but there are still plenty swimming around. The strange thing is that some species have adapted better than others. Mutations don't always kill them off right away, they just make the fish look off. So while they might not be glowing like in cartoons, they're definitely not normal. This is one of the darkest and hardest to talk about. After the explosion, over 600,000 people were called in to help contain the disaster. These weren't all volunteers. Many were soldiers, firefighters, and regular workers who didn't fully understand how dangerous the job was. They were called liquidators, and their job was to clean up the mess, build the sarcophagus over the reactor, and stop the radiation from spreading. There's tons of footage and photographs of these people working away in Chernobyl, completely unaware of how the radiation would affect them later on. A lot of them went in without proper protection too, some with just a cloth mask or nothing at all, and the effects were brutal. Radiation burns, organ failure, thyroid cancer, and in some cases death within mere days. Some liquidators were exposed to such high doses that their bodies literally started breaking down on a cellular level. Some survivors lived for years afterward, but a lot of them did deal with long-term health issues like tumors, birth defects in their children, bone diseases. There are stories of liquidators who ended up completely isolated, physically and emotionally wrecked from what they experienced. So when people talk about mutations, it's not just fish and frogs, it's human lives that were permanently altered. After the Chernobyl disaster, everyone had to evacuate. Of course, that meant most pets, especially dogs, got left behind. Well, in the decades since, those abandoned pets have multiplied into entire packs of wild dogs living in and around the exclusion zone. A recent study from the University of South Carolina and the National Human Genome Research Institute looked into 302 of these dogs. The goal is to see how radiation may have affected them over generations, and it turns out that these dogs aren't just surviving, they might actually be doing pretty well. Unlike bees and some other animals that seem to struggle with reproduction in the area, the dogs are doing just fine. They're reproducing normally, raising litters, roaming free. Scientists believe they may have developed some kind of resistance to the radiation. There's even early evidence showing they're less prone to cancer. Now, we're not saying They're invincible, obviously, but if these dogs really have adapted to these high levels of radiation, that could mean their biology is changing to handle one of the deadliest threats on Earth. It's still early days in the research, but it's enough to make you stop and think. Somehow, these animals have managed to carve out a life in one of the most hostile places on the planet, and that is pretty nuts. If you want straight up visible proof of mutation from Chernobyl, check out the firebugs. These little red and black bugs are normally easy to spot because they have a really distinct pattern. But in the exclusion zone, researchers started finding ones that looked all kinds of messed up. Patterns were totally off. Some bugs had their markings in the wrong spots, others were missing parts altogether. Scientists Timothy Mousseau and Anders Moller actually did a study and found that the bugs living closer to the reactor were way more likely to have these deformities. They photographed tons of them and compared them to firebugs from outside the zone, and yeah, the difference is obvious. It's not the most dramatic mutation you'll ever see, but it's one of the clearest cases that got caught on camera.